So basically, my parents secretly sold our family home to buy my brother a $120,000 apartment, and I only found out when they casually mentioned it during what I thought was a normal family dinner. The house I helped maintain for years, paid property taxes on, and considered my childhood sanctuary was just gone. They acted like it was no big deal and kept insisting my brother needed more help than I did. I spent weeks digging through paperwork and bank records, discovering a web of financial decisions that completely excluded me. When I finally confronted them with proof of everything they'd hidden, they accused me of being selfish and ungrateful. The whole situation tore our family apart, but I learned something important about standing up for yourself even when the people you love try to gaslight you into silence. So I'm Daniel, 32M, engineer. I work at a mid-sized firm downtown, decent salary, nothing fancy, but I get by just fine. I've always been the responsible one in my family, the guy who handled his own problems and never asked for handouts. My parents always treated my younger brother Marcus differently than me. He's 28 and has this way of making everything sound like a crisis that requires immediate family intervention. Failed business ventures, relationship drama, job troubles, there was always something. Meanwhile, I quietly handled my own life, helped with family expenses when needed, and never made waves. The thing is, I actually liked being independent. I bought my own small apartment, paid my bills, and felt proud of what I'd built. But I also stayed close with my parents, visiting regularly and helping maintain the family house where I grew up. I probably spent more weekends there than at my own place, fixing things and handling yard work. My parents seemed to appreciate my help, but they never really acknowledged how much I contributed. They were always focused on Marcus and whatever crisis he was dealing with that week. I told myself it didn't bother me much, that I was secure enough not to need constant validation. Looking back, I realized I was probably in denial about how unbalanced things had become. I kept telling myself that being the stable, reliable son was its own reward. I figured my parents saw my contributions even if they didn't say much about them. I was wrong about that, and the wake-up call was brutal when it finally came. The family meeting started like any other Sunday dinner. I drove over to my parents' house around 5, expecting the usual routine of mom's pot roast and dad complaining about his golf game. Marcus was already there, which wasn't unusual, and everyone seemed relaxed. We were halfway through dinner when my mom brought up some paperwork she needed to file. She mentioned something about property transfers and new addresses, speaking in that casual way people use when they think everyone already knows what they're talking about. I asked her what she meant, and that's when the bomb dropped. My dad explained that they'd sold the house 3 weeks ago. Just like that, matter of fact, like he was telling me about a grocery store trip. I sat there with my fork halfway to my mouth, trying to process what I'd just heard. I asked them why they hadn't mentioned this massive life change to me before now. My mom said they'd been meaning to tell me, but things had been so busy with the move and everything. She acted like forgetting to mention selling the family home was the same as forgetting to mention a dentist appointment. I looked around the dining room where I'd eaten thousands of meals, suddenly realizing this was probably one of the last times I'd sit there. Then Marcus chimed in about how excited he was about his new place. That's when I learned the real story. My parents had used the proceeds from selling the house to buy Marcus a $120,000 apartment downtown. They'd moved into a smaller rental property and basically restructured their entire living situation around getting my brother set up. I asked why Marcus needed them to buy him an apartment, and my parents launched into this whole explanation about how he was finally getting his life together and needed stability to succeed. My dad said Marcus had a new job opportunity that required him to live closer to downtown, and this was their way of helping him take advantage of it. The whole conversation felt surreal. I kept waiting for someone to acknowledge how weird it was that they'd made these huge decisions without involving me at all. Instead, my parents seemed confused about why I was upset. My mom asked if I was worried about my inheritance or something, which made me feel even worse. I tried to explain that it wasn't about money. It was about being part of the family decision-making process. I reminded them that I'd been helping maintain the house for years, paying for repairs and property taxes when they were tight on cash. I'd assumed I was contributing to something that belonged to all of us. My dad got defensive and said I'd always been independent and successful, so they figured I didn't need their help the way Marcus did. He made it sound like being responsible was somehow a disadvantage, like I was being punished for not creating enough drama in my life. The dinner ended awkwardly, with my parents insisting they'd done what was best for the family overall. They kept saying I should be happy for Marcus and proud that they'd found a way to help him succeed. I left feeling like I'd entered some alternate reality where everything I thought I knew about my family was wrong. I couldn't sleep that night, so I drove back to my parents' house around 10. I told myself I just wanted to walk through the place one more time, but really I was hoping to find some evidence that would help me understand what had actually happened. My parents were surprised to see me, but let me in. I asked if I could look through some old paperwork, claiming I needed to find some tax documents for my own records. They seemed nervous about it, but didn't want to appear suspicious, so they directed me to the home office where they kept important files. I started going through filing cabinets and desk drawers, looking for anything related to the house sale. My parents kept hovering around, asking if I needed help finding specific documents. Their behavior was making me more suspicious, like they were trying to steer me away from certain areas. My mom kept suggesting that maybe I should come back another day when I was less tired and emotional. She said I seemed stressed and probably wasn't thinking clearly. I told her I was fine and just wanted to get my paperwork sorted out while I was there. That's when I found the sales contract papers shoved in the back of a drawer that was supposed to contain old utility bills. The documents were dated almost a month earlier, which meant my parents had been planning this sale for much longer than they'd let on. The paperwork showed they'd accepted an offer that was actually pretty good for the local market. But the really shocking part was a handwritten note clipped to the contract that outlined how they planned to use the money. It wasn't just about buying Marcus an apartment. They'd also planned to pay off some of his credit card debt and set aside money for what they called the total amount allocated for Marcus was way more than just the apartment purchase price. I photographed the documents with my phone, trying to be quiet about it. My parents were in the kitchen, and I could hear them having a hushed conversation about something. I couldn't make out the words, but their tone suggested they were discussing me and probably weren't happy about my late-night visit. When I rejoined them in the kitchen, I asked some casual questions about the timeline of the sale. Their answers didn't match what I'd seen in the paperwork. They claimed the decision had been sudden, driven by an unexpected offer from a motivated buyer. But the documents showed they'd been actively marketing the house for weeks. My dad said they hadn't wanted to worry me with the details since it didn't really affect my life directly. He insisted that since I had my own place and career, the family home situation wasn't really my concern. I asked him if he really believed that, and he got annoyed and said I was being overly dramatic about the whole thing. I left feeling even more confused and hurt than before. The paperwork I'd found suggested this wasn't a spontaneous decision to help Marcus. It was a carefully planned financial restructuring that completely excluded me from the process. I started wondering what else they hadn't told me about their plans for the family's future. The next day, I decided to visit Marcus at his new apartment. I figured if I was going to understand what had really happened, I needed to hear his version of events. I called him and said I wanted to see his new place and congratulate him on the move. Marcus seemed excited to show off the apartment, which was in a trendy downtown building with all the modern amenities. The place was definitely nice: hardwood floors, updated kitchen, big windows with a decent view. It was exactly the kind of place I would have loved to afford when I was his age. He gave me the full tour, pointing out all the features and talking about how perfect the location was for his new job. I asked him about this job opportunity that had supposedly motivated the whole move, and his answers were pretty vague. He mentioned something about a startup company and potential for growth, but he couldn't give me specific details about what he'd actually be doing. As we talked, Marcus started getting more comfortable and honest about the situation. He admitted that he'd been struggling financially for months and had asked our parents for help with his rent and credit cards. He said they'd surprised him by suggesting the apartment purchase instead of just lending him money. That's when he really started opening up about the financial arrangement. He told me our parents had covered not just the apartment purchase, but also his moving expenses, new furniture, and several months of utilities and association fees. He seemed almost proud of how much support they'd provided. I asked him if he'd contributed anything to the purchase, and he laughed and said that was the whole point. He couldn't afford to contribute anything, which was why he'd needed help in the first place. He acted like I was being weird for even asking about it. Then Marcus showed me some paperwork he'd left on his kitchen counter, including bank transfer receipts that showed the exact amounts my parents had paid for various aspects of his setup. The receipts confirmed what I'd suspected. The total financial support was significantly more than just the $120,000 apartment purchase. There were additional transfers for furniture, deposits, and what looked like debt payments. Seeing those bank transfer receipts was like getting punched in the stomach. The numbers were so much higher than what my parents had told me, and the dates showed they'd been making these transfers for weeks before they'd even mentioned the house sale to me. This wasn't a sudden decision to help Marcus. It was a comprehensive financial bailout that they'd been planning and executing while pretending everything was normal. Marcus noticed my reaction to the paperwork and asked if I was okay. I told him I was just surprised by how generous our parents had been, and he agreed that they'd really gone above and beyond. He said he felt lucky to have parents who were willing to sacrifice their own comfort to help their kids succeed. The irony of that comment wasn't lost on me. I'd been contributing to the family finances for years, helping with house maintenance and emergency expenses, but somehow I was the one who didn't need support. Meanwhile, Marcus had received what amounted to a comprehensive life makeover funded by selling the family home I'd helped maintain. I left his apartment feeling angry and betrayed in a way I'd never experienced before. It wasn't just about the money. It was about being systematically excluded from major family decisions while being expected to continue contributing to family expenses like nothing had changed. By midweek, I decided I needed to confront my parents more directly, but I wanted to be strategic about it. I didn't want to come across as accusatory or emotional, so I planned to approach the conversation as if I was just trying to understand their reasoning. I showed up at their new rental place on Wednesday evening with takeout dinner, acting like I just wanted to spend time with them and see how they were settling in. The rental was significantly smaller than the house they'd sold, and I could tell they were still adjusting to the reduced space. During dinner, I brought up some practical questions about their financial situation. I asked if they were comfortable with their new housing costs and whether they needed any help with the transition expenses. I was hoping they'd open up about the real numbers behind their decision. My parents seemed touched that I was concerned about their well-being, but they insisted everything was fine. My dad said they'd downsized by choice, not necessity, and that they were actually enjoying the simpler lifestyle. My mom added that it felt good to help Marcus get established, even if it meant some sacrifices for them. I asked them if they'd considered other ways to help Marcus that wouldn't have required selling the family home. I suggested that maybe a loan or gradual support would have achieved the same goal without such a dramatic change. I tried to frame it as genuine curiosity rather than criticism. That's when they started getting defensive. My dad said I didn't understand Marcus's situation and how much he'd been struggling. He claimed that half measures wouldn't have been enough to really make a difference in Marcus's life. My mom said they'd wanted to give Marcus a fresh start, not just temporary relief. I asked why they hadn't discussed these options with me before making the decision. I reminded them that I'd always been willing to help with family expenses and might have been able to contribute to a solution that didn't require selling the house. My mom looked genuinely confused and asked why I would have expected to be part of their decision-making process about their own property. She said I was an adult with my own life, and they hadn't wanted to burden me with their family problems. She made it sound like excluding me had been a courtesy. My dad went further and said that since I'd always been so independent and successful, they'd assumed I wouldn't want to be involved in family financial drama. He said they'd been trying to protect me from having to worry about Marcus's problems or feel obligated to help with solutions. The conversation was becoming surreal. They were essentially telling me that being responsible and self-sufficient had disqualified me from being treated as a full member of the family. They decided that my independence meant I didn't need or want to be included in major family decisions. I tried to explain that independence didn't mean indifference and that I'd always considered myself part of the family team. I told them about all the times I'd helped with house maintenance and emergency expenses because I thought we were all working together to maintain family stability. My parents looked at each other like they were having some kind of silent communication. Then my mom said they appreciated everything I'd done over the years, but they'd never asked me to take on those responsibilities. She said they'd assumed I was helping because I wanted to, not because I expected to be consulted about major decisions. The gaslighting was becoming obvious at that point. They were rewriting history to make it seem like my contributions had been voluntary extras rather than part of a family support system. They were making me feel crazy for expecting to be treated like an equal family member. The next few days were rough. I kept replaying the conversation with my parents, trying to figure out if I was being unreasonable or if they were really as manipulative as they seemed. I'd never questioned my role in the family before, but suddenly I was doubting everything. I spent hours in my apartment going through old financial records, trying to document exactly how much I'd contributed to the family over the years. I found receipts for house repairs, property tax payments, and emergency expenses that totaled way more than I'd realized. I'd been subsidizing the family home for years without really thinking about it. The maintenance and tax payment records I found were pretty eye-opening. There were payments for roof repairs, HVAC maintenance, property taxes, and even some mortgage payments when my parents had gone through a rough financial patch a few years back. I'd covered thousands of dollars in expenses for a house that my parents had just sold without even mentioning it to me. Looking at those records made me realize how much I'd been taken for granted. I'd stepped up whenever the family needed financial help, but somehow that generosity had been interpreted as proof that I didn't need support myself. It was like being punished for being reliable. I started wondering if my parents had factored my contributions into their decision to sell the house. Had they considered that I might have legitimate feelings about a property I'd helped maintain? Or had they just assumed that since I'd never complained about helping out, I didn't really care what happened to the house? The emotional toll was getting to me. I'd always prided myself on being the stable, drama-free son, but now I was questioning whether that identity had actually been healthy. Maybe I'd been so focused on avoiding conflict that I'd allowed myself to be marginalized within my own family. I called in sick to work on Friday because I couldn't concentrate on anything. I spent the day researching property law and family financial rights, trying to understand if I had any legal standing in the situation. Most of what I found suggested that since my parents owned the house outright, they had the legal right to sell it without consulting anyone. But I also found information about financial contributions to family property and how those might create certain expectations or even legal claims. The maintenance and tax payment records I'd kept could potentially demonstrate that I'd had a financial stake in the property, even if my name wasn't on the deed. I wasn't sure if I wanted to pursue any legal action, but knowing I might have options made me feel less powerless. The research also helped me understand that my feelings weren't unreasonable. There were legal concepts that recognized the kind of contributions I'd made to the family property. By the end of the week, I decided I needed to have one more conversation with my parents. But this time I wanted to be prepared with documentation and a clear understanding of what I was asking for. I wasn't sure what outcome I wanted, but I knew I couldn't just let the situation continue without addressing it properly. The hardest part was accepting that my relationship with my parents might never be the same after this. I'd always seen them as fundamentally fair people who loved both their sons equally. But the evidence suggested they developed a pretty skewed view of what each of us needed and deserved, and I wasn't sure that could be fixed. I decided to consult with a lawyer before having another conversation with my parents. I found an attorney who specialized in family financial disputes and scheduled a consultation for Saturday morning. I brought all the documentation I'd gathered, including the sales contract papers, bank transfer receipts, and my maintenance and tax payment records. The lawyer reviewed everything and confirmed what I'd suspected. While my parents had the legal right to sell their property, my financial contributions over the years created what he said I might have grounds for a claim against the estate or even against the proceeds from the sale, depending on how much I'd contributed and whether I could demonstrate that my contributions were made with the understanding that I was investing in family property. More importantly, he said the documentation I'd found suggested my parents had been less than honest about their financial planning and the scope of support they'd provided to Marcus. He advised me that I had strong grounds for demanding transparency about the family's financial decisions, especially given my own contributions over the years. The lawyer suggested that I arrange a family meeting where I could present my concerns formally and request a fair accounting of the family's financial situation. He said that even if I didn't want to pursue legal action, having professional representation might help my parents understand that I was serious about being treated fairly. I decided to take his advice and asked him to attend a family meeting with me. I called my parents and Marcus and told them I wanted to discuss the house sale situation one more time, and that I'd be bringing someone to help facilitate the conversation. They seemed surprised but agreed to meet at the lawyer's office on Sunday afternoon. The meeting was tense from the start. My parents seemed nervous about the formal setting, and Marcus kept asking why I'd felt the need to involve a lawyer in a family discussion. I explained that I wanted to make sure everyone understood the facts and that we could have an honest conversation about what had happened. I started by presenting the sales contract papers I'd found, pointing out the discrepancies between what my parents had told me and what the documentation showed. I explained that they'd been planning the sale for much longer than they'd admitted, and that the financial support for Marcus was much more extensive than they'd initially described. Then I showed them the bank transfer receipts I'd seen at Marcus's apartment, demonstrating the full scope of financial support he'd received. The numbers were significant, well beyond just the apartment purchase price. I asked my parents to explain why they'd been less than honest about these details. My parents got defensive and said they hadn't lied about anything. They just simplified the explanation because they didn't think I needed to know every detail. My dad said the specific amounts weren't really my business since it was their money and their decision how to spend it. That's when I presented my maintenance and tax payment records as proof of my own financial contributions to the family property. I showed them receipts going back years, documenting thousands of dollars I'd spent on repairs, taxes, and emergency expenses for the house they'd just sold without consulting me. The lawyer explained that my contributions created a reasonable expectation that I would be consulted about major decisions affecting the property. He said that while my parents had the legal right to sell their house, they had a moral and potentially legal obligation to consider my interests given my financial investment in the property. My parents looked shocked by the documentation I'd presented. I don't think they'd realized how much I'd contributed over the years, or maybe they'd just chosen not to think about it. My mom said she'd never asked me to pay for those things, and I reminded her that families help each other without keeping score, except when major decisions are being made that affect everyone. Marcus tried to defend our parents by saying they'd been trying to help him get his life together, and that I didn't need help the way he did. I told him that wasn't the point. The point was that I'd been excluded from family financial decisions despite being a significant contributor to family finances. The lawyer suggested that we try to reach some kind of resolution that acknowledged everyone's interests and contributions. He said the goal should be transparency and fairness, not punishment or blame. But it was clear that my parents weren't ready to acknowledge that they'd handled the situation poorly. The immediate aftermath of the lawyer meeting was brutal. My parents were furious that I'd them with legal representation and formal documentation. They felt betrayed and accused me of trying to destroy the family over money. My mom called me later that evening, crying and saying she couldn't believe I'd turned a family disagreement into a legal matter. She said they'd raised me better than that and couldn't understand how I'd become so selfish and vindictive. She made it sound like I was the one who'd created the problem by refusing to just accept their decisions. My dad was even angrier. He said I'd embarrassed them in front of a stranger and made them look like bad parents. He told me that if I was so unhappy with how they'd handled things, maybe I should just distance myself from the family until I could learn to be more grateful for everything they'd done for me over the years. Marcus called me too, saying I'd ruined what should have been a happy time for him. He said he felt guilty about accepting help from our parents now that I'd made such a big deal about it. He accused me of being jealous and trying to sabotage his fresh start because I couldn't handle not being the center of attention. The whole family was treating me like I'd committed some terrible betrayal by asking for honesty and fairness. They'd completely reframed the situation to make me the villain who was destroying family harmony by refusing to accept being marginalized and excluded. But the lawyer had confirmed something important during our meeting. He'd told my parents that my concerns were legitimate and that their handling of the situation had been problematic from a family relationship standpoint, even if it wasn't technically illegal. He'd validated my feelings in a way that my family never had. He'd also pointed out that families who want to maintain healthy relationships need to practice transparency and consideration, especially when significant financial decisions are involved. He'd suggested that my parents' approach of making major decisions without consulting affected family members was likely to create ongoing problems. Over the next few days, I got several more angry calls from family members. My parents had apparently told extended family their version of events, painting me as ungrateful and money-hungry. I started getting calls from aunts and uncles telling me I should apologize and be more understanding of my parents' good intentions. The family narrative was becoming clear. I was the problem child who couldn't accept his parents' generosity toward his struggling brother. No one seemed interested in hearing about the years of financial contributions I'd made or the fact that I'd been systematically excluded from major family decisions. But I also heard from the lawyer again. He'd done some additional research and confirmed that my documentation was strong enough to support a legal claim if I decided to pursue one. He said my maintenance and tax payment records demonstrated a clear pattern of financial investment in the family property that created legitimate expectations about consultation and consideration. More importantly, He said my parents' reaction to being confronted with facts suggested they knew they'd handled the situation poorly. He pointed out that people who are confident in their decisions don't usually respond with anger and accusations when asked to explain their reasoning. I realized I had a choice to make. I could back down and try to repair relationships by accepting my family's version of events, or I could stand firm and demand the respect and consideration I deserved. The lawyer had shown me that I had legitimate grounds for my concerns, both morally and potentially legally. The weeks following the family confrontation were some of the loneliest I'd ever experienced. My parents weren't speaking to me, Marcus was avoiding my calls, and extended family members were treating me like I'd committed some unforgivable sin by standing up for myself. I kept going to work and maintaining my normal routine, but everything felt different. I'd always defined myself partly through my role as the responsible, supportive son and brother. Now that identity was gone, and I wasn't sure who I was supposed to be instead. The isolation was hard, but it also gave me time to think clearly about what had actually happened. Without the constant pressure to maintain family harmony, I could see how dysfunctional the family dynamics had become. I'd been so focused on being helpful and avoiding conflict that I'd allowed myself to be taken for granted and marginalized. I started seeing a therapist to help process everything. She helped me understand that my family's reaction to my concerns was actually pretty revealing. She pointed out that healthy families can discuss financial decisions and address conflicts without resorting to personal attacks and emotional manipulation. The therapist also helped me recognize that I'd been enabling some of the problematic family dynamics by always stepping in to help without setting boundaries or expectations. She said my willingness to contribute financially without asking for consideration in return had actually made it easier for my parents to exclude me from decision-making. During one session, I realized that my parents had never really seen me as an equal adult family member. They'd continued to see me as the responsible child who didn't need attention or support, while Marcus remained the child who needed constant help and protection. My independence had been interpreted as evidence that I didn't need or want to be fully included in family life. The therapist suggested that my confrontation with my parents might actually be healthy in the long run, even if it was painful now. She said I was learning to advocate for myself and set boundaries, which were important skills I'd never really developed within my family system. I also spent time reviewing all the documentation I'd gathered about my financial contributions to the family. Looking at the maintenance and tax payment records over the years, I was struck by how much I'd given without ever asking for recognition or consideration. I'd been operating under the assumption that my contributions were appreciated and valued, but the house sale had shown me that wasn't true. I started thinking about what I actually wanted from the situation. I didn't need my parents to give me money or buy me an apartment like they'd done for Marcus, but I did need them to acknowledge that they'd handled the situation poorly and that my concerns were legitimate. I also realized I wanted them to understand that being independent and successful didn't mean I didn't deserve to be treated as an equal family member. I wanted to be consulted about major family decisions, not because I needed their support, but because I was part of the family and had contributed to family stability over the years. The hardest part was accepting that my parents might never be able to give me what I needed. They seemed committed to their narrative that they'd done nothing wrong and that I was being unreasonable. I had to consider the possibility that our relationship might be permanently damaged. But I also felt something I'd never experienced before, genuine self-respect. For the first time in my life, I'd stood up for myself in a family conflict instead of just accepting whatever role I was assigned. It was scary and lonely, but it also felt authentic in a way that my previous people-pleasing behavior never had. A few months later, I was driving through my old neighborhood and decided to pass by the house where I'd grown up. I hadn't been back to that street since the confrontation with my parents, and I was curious about how it would feel to see the place again. The new owners had already made some changes to the property. They'd painted the front door a different color and planted new flowers in the garden beds I used to maintain. It looked good, maybe even better than when my family had lived there, but it definitely didn't feel like home anymore. I parked across the street for a few minutes and just looked at the house. I felt a little sad about losing that connection to my childhood, but I wasn't devastated the way I'd expected to be. The house was just a building now, not a symbol of family belonging or shared history. What struck me most was how different my perspective had become. A few months earlier, I would have seen the house sale as something that had been done to me, a decision that had victimized me and excluded me from family life. Now I could see it as information about my family's priorities and values that helped me make better decisions about my own life. I'd learned that my parents genuinely didn't see me as someone who needed or deserved consideration in major family decisions. That was painful to accept, but it was also liberating in a way. I didn't have to keep trying to earn a place at the family table that had never really been available to me. The relationship with my parents was still strained, but we'd started having occasional conversations again. They'd never apologized or acknowledged that they'd handled things poorly, but they'd stopped actively blaming me for the conflict. It wasn't the resolution I'd hoped for, but it was something. Marcus and I had talked a few times too. He seemed uncomfortable about the whole situation and kept saying he wished things could go back to how they used to be. I told him that wasn't possible, but that didn't mean we couldn't have a different kind of relationship going forward. The therapist had helped me understand that I could love my family without accepting treatment that made me feel diminished or excluded. I could maintain relationships with them while also protecting my own interests and self-respect. It was a more complicated way to navigate family dynamics, but it felt much healthier. As I drove away from the old house, I realized I wasn't angry anymore. I was sad about some of the things I'd lost, but I was also proud of how I'd handled a difficult situation. I'd learned to advocate for myself and set boundaries, even when it meant risking relationships that were important to me. Epilogue. It's been over a year now since the whole family house situation exploded, and I can honestly say I'm in a much better place emotionally. The relationships with my parents and Marcus are different than they used to be, but they're more honest now, which I've come to value more than fake harmony. My parents and I talk regularly, though we avoid discussing the house sale or Marcus's financial situation. They seem to have accepted that I'm not going to pretend everything was handled perfectly, and I've accepted that they're probably never going to admit they made mistakes. It's not ideal, but it's workable. Marcus is doing okay in his apartment, though I suspect he's still receiving ongoing financial support from our parents. We have a cordial relationship now, but we're not as close as we used to be. I think he understands that I'm not going to enable the family dynamics that led to the original conflict. The biggest change is in how I think about family relationships and my own boundaries. I still help out when there are genuine emergencies, but I don't automatically step in to solve problems that aren't really my responsibility. I've learned that being supportive doesn't have to mean being invisible or taken for granted. I kept all the documentation from the house sale situation, not because I'm planning to pursue legal action, but because it reminds me of an important lesson about standing up for myself. Sometimes doing the right thing means accepting that some people won't like you for it, even people you love.